So yes, if sexual energy is our life force energy, the energy that creates new life, I always say if we're not creating babies with that energy, then we can use that energy consciously as a procreative source in our lives to shape our worlds, to shape who we are, what happens within us, right? That whole notion of we create our own reality. Indeed, we do. And we create it best from our genitals. Like that energy, that's its purpose. That's what it's there for. And that is the massive obscuring that's gone on to hide that reality from people and instead distort it with all of these other concepts and censorship and detours around what this energy really is. Like I'll actually say that the fountain of youth, this esteemed, fabled place that people go to search, that's our sexual energy. That's what the fountain of youth actually is.
Welcome to Far Out with Faust, everybody. I am Faust Chicho, and today we've got a very stimulating show for you today. It's a good word to use with my special guest, Kim Anami, an internationally recognized writer, speaker, podcaster, and holistic sex coach. Kim believes that our sexual energy is life force, creative energy that we can literally change the world with when we learn to master it. At a young age, Kim had already experienced the power of sex to awaken, transform, and accelerate her journey of self-actualization. She began practicing Tantra and studying Taoist philosophy, laying the foundation for what would become her coaching practice and expertise. She calls the system she has is a spiritual synthesis of 2 decades of Tantra, Taoism, Osho, transpersonal psychology, philosophy, and a host of quantum growth accelerating practices. Sounds really awesome, doesn't it? She helps clients achieve higher levels of connection, intimacy, energy, and creativity. She's legend for many reasons. One is because of her practice of vaginal kung fu. No, you didn't hear that wrong. This woman actually lifts weights with her vagina. We'll get into that when we get to it. But her work has been featured in many publications around the globe, including Playboy, Oprah Magazine, Cosmopolitan, The Daily Mail, GQ, CNN, NPR, and a whole list more. We're going to get into all the juicy details about holistic sex and relationship philosophies that she has and teaches about. But we're also going to go far out, I promise, because we're going to be exposing the truth about our true sexual power and how that resides within us as divinely spiritual beings and how it's being appropriated and manipulated and why. And this goes so much deeper than just sex. And we're going to try to expose as much as we can of it today. Thank you so much for beaming in, Kim. It's an honor and a pleasure to have you. It's been a long time coming. No pun intended.
That's always good. We like the extended sex dates and foreplay. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Awesome. Yeah. So my God, it took us so long to arrange this. I'm so excited to finally have you. I've been a fan of your work for a year now since I found you. And let's jump right in. So for people who aren't familiar with your work, let's give them an overview of how you view human sexuality and how that informs your philosophy about the physical practice of sex.
Sure. I'm curious, how did you find me?
That's a great question. So I feel like Instagram fed me something that you, I had a woman on my podcast. Her name is, I want to pronounce it Art. God, it's been over a year. Arja, maybe you know her. She's also in your line of work. Maybe the algorithms saw me, sharing and hearting things that she was posting, and that's how you showed up. I'm not sure, but I was like, holy shit! I was like, and then I think I saw you eventually on Kelly Brogan, who I just had on as a guest, and I was like, hey, look, I was like, it's Kim, and because I said to my people, and they were like, "Oh yeah, yeah," and so we were trying to follow up, and yeah, that's how I found you. I think it's due to those algorithms and my
Well, that's
previous
great to know that I'm
preferences.
still they're you working for me and not against me. I feel like they're often cock blocking
Yeah.
me, so it's great to know that they're actually doing what they're meant to do sometimes. So, look, so my whole philosophy around sex and intimacy is that sex is a portal to enlightenment, and my own podcast is called Orgasmic Enlightenment for that reason. And back when I was in my late teens and I was studying transpersonal psychology, as you do as a teenager. That's what I did as a teenager, and learning about self actualization and Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I was having these very profound sexual experiences. And I thought, where I would feel like I became more of my true self, more of who I really am. I would feel like it was like taking ecstasy. I would reach these higher states of consciousness and pure sobriety just through accessing sexual energy. And the terms that I would use then to describe it were the ones I'd been learning about in my spiritual studies and my psychological studies, these states of ecstasy, transcendence, self-realization. So my bar for what sex is and what it can do was set quite high early on, that it was much more than just a physical dumping of energy, or like a lustful bust an orgasm out and fall asleep. It was about these spiritual awakening states. And like I said, becoming more of who I really am. So that then when I learned about Tantra and Taoism in my early 20s, I was like, oh, wow, like there are actually people and cultures who discuss these things and study these things and had a way to articulate it that reflected my own experiences. Because obviously in our culture,
Yeah.
most Western and I mean even Eastern cultures, sex and God, never the twains shall meet unless it's in the basement of a Catholic church, right? Like
Right.
they're separated in this paradoxical way, and yet because they're so suppressed, all these energies end up permeating and coming through in all sorts of untoward and very mutated ways. So that was lovely to see. Okay, so there's a whole world out there, or used to be, where people looked at these things and studied them. And then at the same time, I've always had a passion, like since again my late teens, for holistic health and healing, and been on that journey. And so all of that combined became my own genre of what I do, which is holistic sex and relationship work, and not using band-aids ever, right? Like I've never given a woman lube to go use. I say lubrication ought to be generated from within. I would never tell a man to go use Viagra because erections ought to be generated from within. And if those things aren't happening, that's the body's way of telling us, right? The body is the ultimate barometer, and our sexual, and to find out like, okay, well, what is the message, right? So a man often, let's just say with a lack of erectile issue or potency, he's not really showing up in his masculinity and his potency in his life. And so his erection is the same way. And a woman, when she's not lubricated, often women are really encouraged to override their bodies anyway and just have sex when they don't really feel like it. Bottle of lube is a girl's best friend. Like that's what women are taught, right? If you're a liberated woman, like you'll have a bottle of lube. I'm like, that's the most bizarre anti
Yeah.
power programming ever. But so I'm all about listening to those messages and then using the body as the ultimate portal to getting to know ourselves and become the truest, highest versions of who we really are. So a lot of what I do is spent explaining to people why to have sex, how sex is really meant to be as this life-giving, healing, regenerative, energizing experience. And the question I usually ask is, does sex leave you feeling energized, rejuvenated, transformed, ecstatic, and like it changed your life, and like you like to go and run a marathon afterwards? If no, then you're doing it wrong, because sex is meant to give you energy. It's meant to be your creative power source. It's meant to make you feel like you can conquer the world after you have it, rather than dumping all your vital energy into a piece of toilet paper and flushing it down the toilet, right? So technique is a small part of what I do. I mean, there's energy techniques and energy cultivation and harnessing techniques that I teach people. But if it was just about 99 blowjob tips, like why doesn't every woman give an epic blowjob? It's because she doesn't want to, right? Because
Right.
there's some blockage there. So
Oh yeah.
early on in working with people, I could see that the issue wasn't that people didn't have mechanical technique. It's that there were much deeper issues going on that were blocking them from really tapping into their own vital sexual energy and power. So that's the huge part of my work. And yeah, I'll throw out techniques here and there, but really it's trying to convince people why to have more sex and deeper, better, life-giving sex.
You know, I think that one of the biggest blocks to people really even having the courage and the curiosity to explore this sometimes can be trauma and all this cultural conditioning we have in this country between religion and you have two sides of the problem with this the porn that is out, and there's a not that there's anything inherently wrong with that, but there's pitfalls with it. I don't think it's the healthiest thing for people to be focused on when they could be focused on each other. But that's got to be something that comes up a lot in your with working with people, like how to get them past the trauma that may be blocking them, or the conditioning. I'm sure that's a big obstacle in your line of work, or I'm wondering if it is.
Oh, 100%. I mean, I talk a lot about the idea of clearing blockages. And I have something that I call the Anami guarantee, which is that everyone can, right? In more traditional circles or like woke circles or even allopathic circles, they'll say things like, oh, some women can have these types of orgasms and some women can't. Don't you worry your pretty little head about it if you can't do it.
Right.
Or for men, well, some men, like you have this disease called premature ejaculation, and the cum fairy comes along and she waves her magic wand and she makes you come, right? Like you have zero responsibility as a person and zero ability to change anything, right? Where I'm the opposite and I say, I guarantee that every woman can have multiple G spot, cervical, ejaculating orgasms where the squirting ejaculate hits the ceiling. Every woman can shoot ping pong balls with her vagina. Every woman has a high libido and is a voracious, salacious, lubricating, ejaculating being. Every man can be multiply orgasmic and learn to separate orgasm from ejaculation and want to run a marathon after sex. Every single person can. The only reason if they are not in touch with those things is because there's blockages there. So yes, a big part of my work is helping people to pull away the layers of conditioning, beliefs, trauma that have been superimposed upon
Mm,
their innate, natural, powerful sexual expression. And everything from sexual trauma, which is a huge one,
mm,
for men, circumcision, which is one that's been often socially endorsed, but I would consider to be rape and mutilation. Um, obviously outright rape and mutilation for like either sex,
right.
religious beliefs and programming like that really infuse that notion that sex is shameful and taboo. And I often say like sex really is the biggest psyop in the world because you have all of this creative life force energy at your fingertips literally, and for the amount of connection people actually have with it, it might as well be a million miles away, right? Where people are
Yeah.
terrified to, some women won't even put their hands in their own vaginas. Men, I would say like premature ejaculation is symptomatic of a trauma response. Like they're terrified to go deep. And so they just bail out really quickly.
Yeah.
There's all kinds of parallels, but all of that, all reproductive ailments to me in my line of work in my system are all symptomatic of stuck sexual energy or trauma of some kind. Women don't just randomly get negative or painful periods. Men don't just randomly get impotency issues. Those things are all indicative of the state of our overall being.
Absolutely. What about like the variance of sex drive that is, I mean, we've been taught to believe that some people, and I think that to a degree this is true, but to the degree that it's true, I think also depends on the amount of conditioning and trauma involved. But the varying degree of sexual drive in people, and some people are, seemingly hornballs, and other people are, not so much, and sometimes those people get married, and then you have this accommodating that takes place. What, in your experience working with couples like that, what is there a particular pattern that you find? I'm sure that it's pretty common.
Well, it could be either extreme, could be symptomatic of some layer of programming, trauma, conditioning, like somebody who's, say, compulsively sexual, right? Like they're busting out orgasms as a way to, like the way you can use anything addictively,
Right.
right? Like within,
It
um,
becomes habitual. It becomes that's
or
yeah.
an escape, right? Like I talk about using sex to become conscious versus using sex to become unconscious, or
Mm,
junk food sex versus gourmet sex in my terminology. So, but I would say, and like someone who, I don't believe that some people naturally have a lower sex drive or naturally have a higher sex drive. I don't believe that. If they're two extremes, right? Somebody who's compulsive, I'd say that is out of balance.
right,
But
right.
I would say that a normal, healthy amount of sex to be having is every day, and the minimum 3 to 4 times a week for any couple. And if it's below that, then I'd say there's something amiss. So
Mm.
I don't buy into people naturally have a lower libido. No, definitely not. That to me would be some kind of programming, trauma, blockage that needs clearing.
There's a lot of rewards that can come from seeking this kind of clearance, rewards in relationship, rewards in your own self evolution, self mastery. And oftentimes, I know, from speaking to people and from experience, that you get this help for one thing, and then it clears the way for all these other things that you didn't know were being held back by this, right? I mean, I just thought I would put that out there. I feel like that is so, that's such a truth, because sometimes that trauma that's blocking, it's blocking so much that you've been trying to manifest. And sexual energy is life force. That is the energy. That is everything. So people underestimate how powerful it is. So I hear what you're saying. I and that was one of my questions about this. The biggest psyop, and I was going to ask you what you mean by that. These hidden agendas and programmings that we get. I don't know if you have anything you want to add about that. I think you just touched on it pretty well.
I think it's deliberate, all of this shaming and taboo, because when you look at these ancient cultures, like 5,000 years ago in India with Tantra, and in China with Taoist sexual practices and their other healing modalities, they looked at sex as medicine. They looked at sex as a portal to, as I said, higher states of consciousness. And that was my own experience before I even learned about these other cultures and studies and ideas. I was just having these experiences. So to have in our modern culture, and to have it very deliberately like woven into all of these places, like through religion, through media, advertising, pop songs, all of this messaging that's very anti, like this whole conscious versus unconscious, or junk food sex to like help you pass out, go to sleep, a more very superficial version of that, which is a massive obscuring of the true profound potential of sexual energy. So yes, if sexual energy is our life force energy, the energy that creates new life, I always say if we're not creating babies with that energy, then we can use that energy consciously as a procreative source in our lives to shape our worlds, to shape who we are, what happens within us, right? That whole notion of we create our own reality. Indeed, we do. And we create it best from our genitals. Like that energy, that's its purpose. That's what it's there for. And that is the massive obscuring that's gone on to hide that reality from
Mm.
people, and instead distort it with all of these other concepts and censorship and detours around what this energy really is. Like I'll actually say that the fountain of youth, this esteemed, fabled place that people go to search.
Mm-hmm.
That's our sexual energy. That's what the fountain of youth actually is. And if you look through some of these ancient texts that talk about it, they refer to it as the coiled serpent that springs. Like, it's all this language that so speaks to
Mm-hmm.
sexuality, right? So I just see it as a big sham and farce, like all of the ways that the programming happens. And it's so complex and sophisticated, and they work so very, very hard at it. Like, even porn, this morning, somebody sent me a link saying that during the lockdowns in Israel/Palestine, in Palestine, these, everybody's, I mean, I'm assuming this is true, but I actually heard it somewhere else as well,
What?
that they were like blasting porn 24/7, every single TV channel. You couldn't watch anything else. When people were locked in their homes,
You
all
know,
they
they
could,
they gave it away for free in our country, in the United States. They made it
yeah,
free. Yeah,
exactly. Right? Why do you do that? Why do you give things away for free? Like,
unfucking
everything must be paid for in the true coin, as the spiritual axiom says. So I see these things as very deliberate, distortion and detours away from the truth of what our sexual energy really is. And that if we divorce any kind of moral taboo, judgment overlay, it's simply an energy source. Like, if we think about doing Tai Chi or Qigong and the conscious movement of energy, that's what our sexual, it's just another, version of our energy that's even more potent and strong because
mm-hmm.
it's that creative life force. So all of my work is about teaching people to tune into and consciously channel that energy into their lives, right? Yes, have better sex, have better relationships. But I think what I'm even more passionate about is the power of what that energy really can do when you are infusing it into your life.
Absolutely. It's one of the, if not the most powerful, I think, force that a human can wield. I mean, it's because it's directly connected to soul and love, and there's, I mean, I could talk about that by itself for hours, but I want to get to my next question. It strikes me as just incredibly ironic that ever since the so-called sexual revolution, that was supposed to be about liberation and love, that we were only becoming more and more dysfunctional around sex, and young people aren't having sex because, I mean, the social interaction is not there. They barely know how to
They
talk
don't
to
have
each other.
genitals anymore. Those things are
They're
gone.
between the chemical, the surgical, they're being castrated in many ways, not just figuratively, but literally. You know, then there's porn, and sex trafficking is an all-time high. And I'm just like, you know, I see the subtle movements happening with, and I want to be careful how I say this so I don't get in trouble with YouTube's wonderful new censorship laws. But you know, the whole minor attraction, which is a ridiculous term, is being normalized, and this has been going on for a while. But like, I'm wondering what you have to say about what is going on, and how, we're a hypersexualized society that has kind of paradoxically lost our individual sexual power, and girls are being gaslit to believe that, indiscriminately giving away their sexual energy is empowering and part of the feminine movement, while boys are being told that, testosterone is toxic. But don't worry, it's being weeded out one way or the other for these poor kids. How do we fix this as a society?
Well, I think this is all evidence of, again, this distortion, this distraction, moving people away from what the truth of their sexuality and sexual energy really is. And, creating so many more layers of blockages that it becomes so difficult to come back and find that real essence of what that is within them. So, in terms of a solution, I mean, I think the more that we do our own personal work and our own block clearing, we change our frequency, our relationship to sexuality. Like, in my podcast, I have a feature I called "Well Fucked All Stars," where
Yeah, I love that.
when I first started my podcast, I was like, I didn't want to interview, like I looked around and all these podcasts were doing the exact same thing, interviewing this recycled roster of wellness people. And I was like, I have no interest in doing, and I don't respect most of them anyway, right? So I was like, who would I have on my podcast? And I was like, the people who actually know the most, apart from me, about sexuality are my students, like the people who go through my programs, and they just
Yeah.
they nail it, right? So people who have these incredible wild stories, and so I bring them on the podcast. And the people who make it into a well fucked woman or well fucked man territory, they've crossed over this threshold of having done their own personal work, and they've worked hard and played harder, and they end up transforming so much that they become a new, improved, elevated version of themselves, and people notice it, right? People are attracted to them, they gravitate to them, like, what are you doing different? Like, what happened to you? And they're becoming walking, talking ambassadors, right? And they actually do become ambassadors. Like, their frequency is an ambassador, even if they don't talk about what they've done. But if they do end up talking about it to their children, to their teenagers, to their friends, to their family, they become even bigger ambassadors. And so it's that whole like change yourself, change the world thing, right? Where the more that we do that, and the numbers of people who grow in doing that, we create that tipping point of change. I don't really think we're quite there yet, but I'm happy to be part of this movement and initiating a movement of people who are getting to that place. And and that reflects down into even how we talk to like, if we're the best sex education we can give our children is doing our own sexual healing, because our
Yeah.
children pick up by osmosis. They pick up all of our unhealed traumas and they
Yep.
take them in, right? And our positive things as well. But the more confusion, disarray, suppression we have around sexuality, our children just take all of that in, and that's what they will go forward and create with, right? So not only do we want to be having open conversations and modeling healthy sexuality, but just in doing our own healing is profoundly affecting our children and the vision and like view of sexuality that they will grow up with and embody.
Yeah. Speaking of children, um, do, do you have children, Kim?
I have a child, yes.
You do? Okay. Because I feel like that's, the first statement on many people who are listening, if they have children and they hear you say, you should be having sex once they're going to be thinking, oh, she obviously doesn't have kids.
Right.
Um,
I
that's
do.
just me kind of tuning into what my female audience might be thinking, or might be saying, I'm probably right about that. But anyway, you do. That's good to know. I love it because you're answering my questions before I even ask them. So it's a wonderful synchronicity. So tell me about this, because when I saw this, I thought for sure that I was reading this wrong when I first learned about vaginal kung fu, and I want to hear about how you got into this, and maybe you can share a couple experiences you've had, performing this practice. But I talk a lot about ancestral practices on my show, and I'd love for you to share a little bit about the history of this. What is I'm learning an ancient tradition.
Okay, bookmark that. I just want to quickly address your comment about
Oh, please, yeah,
the excuses, let's say, right?
yes,
And
please.
having children is one of the biggest excuses and most socially validated ones that people have in terms of not having sex. And I would argue that it's simply prioritizing and committing, and having children will create more of a wedge if a couple already has a wedge between them. And often that's exacerbated through a traumatic birth experience, which is what
Hmm.
most people end up having as well. But, there's one couple I love to cite an example, and they're reflective of many, but they are both on their second marriage. They have 5 children between them. They both work super high powered executive jobs, beyond executive, and they have sex every single day because they commit to it. They both had really lousy first marriages, like not sexual marriages, sexless marriages. And then they committed, like, in our next marriage, we're going to really focus on this and make it happen. And so they did. It's that simple, right? So
Yeah.
I don't buy your excuses if you have them. And I have a really great podcast episode called The Biggest Reason Why Couples Don't Have Sex. And it's about children, right? And like me debunking all that stuff.
Oh,
So,
good.
um,
I'm going to bookmark that one. Yeah.
yeah. So vaginal kung fu. Well, because I'd begun studying these Taoist practices in my early 20s, so that's about 30 years ago, I had learned about the jade egg. So the jade egg is a Taoist tool for strengthening the vagina. Again, this is part of this 5,000-year-old school of techniques for sexual wellness and regeneration. So it sounds, if you haven't heard of it, just like it is. It's a piece of jade carved into the shape of an egg. There's a hole drilled through it. You thread string through the hole. The egg goes in the vagina, string comes out, and then you can attach weighted objects to it. And so the reasoning, I mean, the whole purpose of it is for, yes, pelvic floor strengthening, and which eliminates and prevents urinary incontinence, pelvic organ prolapse, but it's also generating sensation, increasing pleasure, orgasm potential, increasing lubrication. Like, it's like exercising any other part of your body.
Right.
It's meant to be exercised. Men are meant to do penile exercises and weightlifting. Women are meant to do vaginal exercises and weightlifting. So in my work, so I started using that egg and had very deliberate, like very quick results. Like partners would respond right away. They'd be
Mm-hmm.
like, what's doing? Like they would feel
Yeah.
something
What's
different within, a few days of working the practice. So the results are very fast. And then as I began doing my work over the years, women would always come to me and they'd say, my Kegels don't seem to work for me. I don't know. I guess I'm just one of those women they don't work for. And I would hear this again and again and again. And I realized that they don't work for anybody. They never worked for me either, right? Like clenching your vagina 300
yeah.
times at random in the wind. It's like airlifting, right? It's like doing a bicep press in the air and then
Yeah.
being like, I don't know.
It's
Maybe
not
because you're
working.
thinking, yeah, why am I not building muscle? I don't understand. And so it's funny, like the original Kegel exercise created by Dr. Kegel, this OBGYN back in 1947, involved using a device inside the
Mm.
vagina that women would clench upon and contract their muscles. So it was using feedback and resistance, just like we do with weight training,
Mm.
right? To build muscle. And he had a 90% success rate with treating urinary incontinence with women. And then
Wow.
when the
That's
exercise,
huge. That's
it's
amazing.
massive. Yeah, massive. And then as soon as like other doctors began adapting the exercise and they took out the piece of having something in the vagina. And the only way that I can reconcile that is thinking that they must have been so terrified to
Mm.
tell women to go home and put something in their vaginas
Yeah.
that they just took that piece out. And immediately the success rate tanked like 50% and it's plummeting, right? Like the statistics on women's urinary incontinence, up to 60% of women have urinary incontinence. Okay, that is
Wow.
fucked. And the amount of women who suffer some kind of pelvic organ prolapse, literally their organs falling out of their bodies after childbirth, is 50%. These
Wow.
statistics are abysmal and a reflection of the state of the absolutely atrocious OBGYN
Mm-hmm.
industry that's out there. So then I started teaching the jade egg. I started doing these workshops and classes, and women would have immediate results. This one woman who was in her 50s, recently divorced after like a 25-year marriage, she couldn't go for a run without wearing some kind of diaper, right?
Damn.
Hot, attractive woman, but serious incontinence issues. And she was so stoked to get out in the dating world and meet the next, like her new man. She was doing the egg every day. Within 1 week, the incontinence she'd had for 20 years was gone,
Wow.
completely gone. And I was like, okay, boom, here we go. And I didn't have that myself. So I didn't have kind of a
Yeah.
dramatic, I just knew, like I said, I would feel the difference. My partners would feel the difference. But then I began getting these stories and then I converted that into my whole online programs that I teach, one of which is Vaginal Kung Fu. But I want to add another piece to that story is that,
Sure.
part of what I do, like the way I talk about sexual energy as creative energy, like I see my role, my work in the world. I'm a teacher, I'm a healer, but I'm a business owner and an entrepreneur, but I'm also a very creative person. And my view is that the proof is always in the pudding. If you're really tapping into your sexual energy, that shows up in creative pursuits in your life. You take that energy. So that might be I'm a writer, a content creator, an artist of sorts. Other people, that might be decorating their home or raising their children or gardening in their yard. We
Yeah.
just interviewed an ultra marathoner last week in my podcast, Marathon Man, Marathon Cock, and he channels all of his sexual energy into winning ultra marathons, 50-mile, 100K
Wow.
marathons, right? And he shared all about it. It's amazing. So I'm very well known for hashtag things I lift with my vagina, which is a campaign I created back in 2015, featuring me traveling all around the world, lifting objects indigenous to various regions with my vagina. So I would be lifting Murano glass chandeliers in Venice, in Bali, various types of tropical fruit from pineapples to green coconuts. I went to Berlin and I lifted a piece of the Berlin Wall at the Berlin Wall, which I've now
Wow.
dubbed the Great Wall of Vagina. So, and I went very viral for this, but that's because that's me taking my sexual energy and channeling it into my work, my brand, my vision of what I do. And that is that thing, like that's the proof in the pudding, right?
Mm.
Is where that energy becomes an unstoppable flow that we joyfully transmit into everything we do in the world.
It's incredible. You're an incredible woman. It's remarkable. You should have a gold belt that you wear, like champion. Like, I don't know, something that, I mean, people who know you know that anyway. But just remarkable. Something just came to mind, and I was having this discussion with a friend of mine. You know, so recently, I mean, not recently. This is obviously just as old as many of these traditions, but you have one faction which is telling men, save your seed, save your seed. It's everything, and that when you blow when you have an orgasm, all your vitamins and minerals are coming out, and it takes you weeks, days to replace them. And that now I hear that they're telling women the same thing about their orgasms, and I was like, okay, I don't understand how that translates over to the feminine orgasm, but I'm like, I got to ask Kim about this, because I'm sure that, like everything, the truth lies somewhere in the middle. But I'm wondering what you think about it.
Look, I would say that yes, I agree with that notion that men lose a lot of vital energy from a physiological standpoint, but also from an energetic standpoint. I think your audience is probably open to these ideas. Um, and so if they're breathing, I'd say the more unconscious the ejaculation, the more energy is lost, right? So
Mm,
the base level of that would be like jerking off an orgasm to porn to fall asleep.
right.
Lowest use of sexual energy. I'm not saying I have no moral judgment. I don't care. I'm saying like the lowest, most unconscious use of sexual energy would be
Like the
that.
McDonald's of orgasms. Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. Boom. Huge amount of energy loss. I had a client years ago. He was in his early 20s and he'd been jerking off to porn every single day since he was 12. And he was 22 when I came to see him. He
Wow.
was completely bald. He'd lost all of this vital energy through depletion,
Wow.
through excessive use, dumping it out. So, just lost my train of thought.
Maybe.
Okay, semen retention and all that, right? So,
Yeah.
um, so that's the lowest use. The highest use would be some kind of exchange with the partner, like where there's more of an energetic exchange. You're not
Hmm.
dumping so much of it out. But even then, I would say each ejaculation exacts a toll on the body and on the psyche. And so the ideal best of all worlds is orgasm without ejaculation, and all men can learn how to do that. So you can have full body, life-giving, energizing orgasms without dumping out the fluid, and using different practices to recirculate that energy in the body. So that's cultivating, that's harnessing, that's harvesting the sexual energy, which to me is the ultimate answer, versus no fap or just like no ejaculation. It's a little bit like the celibacy where you're kind of holding all of, I
Yeah.
think it's better than excessive jerking off, but
Right.
just holding all that energy in and not realizing that you have it as this power source to use is also not ideal. Right.
Yeah.
And so when I've looked at some of these guys who've talked about, you know, that don't have sex before the big game kind of thing. And like
That's
last
it. Yeah.
week, the guy that I
Boxers are
interviewed,
notorious for this. You know, I
right.
do a lot of boxing, and they're like, you know, don't before if we're gonna spar, if you have a max, they're like, you know, they say that women weaken legs, you know, and I'm like, is that what it is? I never really understood how that.
Well, yeah, there were a few quotes I pulled from David Hayes was talking about. Even Miles Davis makes this joke. He said, "I'll fight Muhammad Ali as long as you make him have sex first." Like, I'll fight him.
God, that's
But he
crazy.
has to promise to have he has to he has to promise to fuck first. So I think the ultimate, like I said, the best of all worlds is learning how to cultivate this energy, harvest it and use it rather than just suppressing it and keeping it, like trying to keep it in stasis, which it just can't do.
Right. So, like what comes to mind is, I mean, I've come into a bit of a practice with this anyway, but for guys who are listening who have not experienced this really in any way except maybe by accident, if you remember back when you were a teenager, maybe, and you were trying to get it on with a young lady, but you had to navigate the realm of parents and or people interrupting you, and so whatever was going on was extended, right? If you can recall how much energy you had by, let's say, you know, the second and third hour of this exchange, and how, I mean, I can viscerally recall, you know, you could run a 50k. You could, it feels like you could run like 30 miles. You have so much energy that you've kind of driven into a vortex because of all the stopping and starting of the situation. I'm just trying to give guys who maybe are listening to this who have, you know, not really any experience with how much energy is there for you to access when you start to learn some of these techniques. So I'm just trying to give them an idea, because I think a lot of guys, even though they maybe have not had any kind of practice with this, they probably can remember that time when they were, you know, or a few times when they were younger, when that kind of energy was stirred up in their body, and just how, you know, my God, it's incredible the amount of energy that it harnesses for you. Anyway, that
Right.
was,
I
yeah.
mean, well, sometimes people say, you know, oh, but will I get blue balls? And you might if you're not breathing, right? Like, so I think your description is a good one. But if people also associate that with some level of discomfort, or sometimes it's really just that thing, like an association that you need to
Mm,
discharge. And when you learn to contain and then redirect and channel, it might be a mental shift and rewiring, but
hmm.
that's really all it is. It's like an association with exhaustion as being, or depletion as being relaxation, when really it's depletion. And
Yeah.
that you can, you know, once you flip that around and learn how to work with it, you'll be in a better place.
Yeah. I love the way you put that. That's very true. And I think that's, you know, I'm part of the process, you know, and rewiring and beginning to separate not only ejaculation from orgasm, but also in the mind, what sex is and what it can be. You know, many guys in particular have had their whole lives to establish, you know, certain circuitry and ideas, and we know about, you know, how belief systems very difficult to crack, to say the least. But I think this is a wonderful incentive, And of course, once you start cracking paradigms, you can discover a whole new world. So I love this work, and I love what you're doing. You also talk a lot about duality, and those eternal dichotomies that make up our universe. Light and dark, yin and yang, male and female. Um, and what you say about the type of men that women really want is kind of more of a textbook definition of what masculinity has always meant, and at least until recently. And research bears this out, that women are most attracted to those archetypes, like soldiers, kings, sheriffs, cowboys, warriors. I mean, strong men. And I'm sure you've done a lot of reflecting on why our current society has moved so forcefully to deny this reality in so many ways. And I'm wondering if you could want to talk a little bit about that and what set us on this insane mission to vilify masculinity, and then how, maybe you could share with us how it's affected you personally to be one of those kind of very few voices that are standing up and countering this bullshit narrative, and whether you've taken heat for that yet or not.
Well, I think it's a deliberate, men in their archetypal form, like you said, warriors, powerful men are the protectors of the realm. That is their job. That is their archetypal role in the village, in the culture, with women. They are that container, right? That protector who will fight if there's danger. And the fact that that's been so systematically eroded within men and within our values in a culture, that you can only see that it's deliberate, right? So why do they want to erode this? Why do they want to remove this urge, this innate natural urge for men to protect, to be the guardians? And and you can only think, well, it's part of a larger agenda, so that doorway, that gatekeeper role that men played, they no longer play that role. So whatever is standing between the last bastions of protection of the women, the children, the culture, the values, that's gone. And so, yeah, I'm a huge voice for that, because I see how, of course, how women are just more deeply, viscerally attracted to that male. And if they end up with a male who isn't that, I would say that's from their own internalized programming, fear, a desire for safety that they think is safe, right? But actually isn't, because they're not safe with those kinds of men.
No,
Um, but they
especially
think
these
it's
days,
safer.
more than ever. Yeah.
What's that?
I said especially these days, with so many people knocking on your door, telling you what you need to do. I mean,
Exactly, exactly. And so I think that's very deliberate. And I mean, in terms of me speaking out and getting heat about that, I mean, maybe here and there, there's people who come after me for that kind of thing, and I might be off of certain, I don't know, like favorable lists from
yeah,
maybe some slices of society, and I don't care. Like, I'm all about speaking this and then being a voice and being able to validate people who do think these things. And sometimes they just need to hear someone say it really clearly for it to gel in their minds of what their actual truth is. Like, they can feel like, okay, I don't really buy into this, but I don't quite know what the other option is. Like, what is the truth? And then they hear it spoken and demonstrated, and then that internal divining rod latches and clings, and they're like, okay, right, that's it. So I love being that place to bring people together and to, as I said, validate what's innately being activated within them and help them to amplify that, right? And I actually have fun with it nowadays, right? Like,
yeah,
being that contrarian voice is itself a turn on and fun. And especially when there's such a giant fear campaign of trying to
yeah.
muzzle people and control them. And if the muzzle was ever a more fitting symbol than it is in our
My
culture
God,
these days and has been over the past few years, I mean, nothing is more symbolic of what's really going on deeper levels, right?
that's for
Than
sure.
that symbol people like to advertise on their faces in
Yep,
real time.
perfectly said. could not have said it better myself. It is absolutely that. I recently had Bruce Lipton on my show, and I know you're also a fan of Bruce's.
Yeah.
And you make a really interesting analogy regarding our sexual energy and what he says about human cells and how they can go into a protection mode versus a growth mode. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Back, I can't remember when I first discovered, 2004, that's when I first discovered Bruce Lipton's work. And I was watching a presentation. I was at this sort of week-long workshop thing, and they were involving some of his ideas. And that was one of the things. I was taking notes on a scrap piece of paper, right? And I heard that, and I just was like, whoa, that is everything. So he talks about, he's got so many great analogies for the
He does.
cellular microcosm versus the macrocosm in life. And he talked about how a cell can only be in protection or growth mode. It cannot be in both at the same time. So therefore, if a cell is in protection, it cannot grow. And I thought that was just so apropos and fitting to the work that I do, where if an individual, let's say, is locked in a trauma
Mm,
response, in protection, in fear, they cannot grow. If a couple is locked into that mechanism, they cannot grow. And that's why that whole block clearing thing became so instrumental in all of the work that I do, that we would have to remove those defense mechanisms, those walls we've built towards within the relationship with each other, within ourselves, our own defense mechanisms, or we cannot grow. And that happened like years back. I had a woman come to see me where she was she was like an educated, intelligent professional, and who worked with bodies actually. And I would give her all these things to do, and she would come back and she was like the worst client, right? She wouldn't do these things.
she
She
had an
wouldn't do her
excuse for
homework.
everything.
Yeah. And I was like, what is it? This is a really like driven, accomplished person, motivated. Like, what's going on? And then it came out that she'd been brutally sexually assaulted
Oh
twice,
my
not
God.
once, but twice in her life. And she could only have sex when she was drunk,
Wow.
only have sex when she was drunk. And I realized, okay, she's still got all this trauma response. And so then we did a lot of like deeper rewiring, clearing of those experiences. And then she was able, with that strong rebuilt foundation, then she could layer on all of the more higher level
Yes.
practices that I offer. But before doing that, nothing could happen. Right. And that perfectly illustrates the protection versus growth. No growth could happen with her until we'd cleared away the impulse for and the built-in structures for protection.
It's a perfect analogy, a metaphor, whatever the appropriate word is. It's amazing that you hit on it the way you did, and it's absolutely worth repeating. I feel like this is so prevalent. I feel like so many women have unattended traumas that I don't think they realize are one of the biggest reasons why their not only their sex life but their relationships can get into so much trouble. And the same thing goes for men, of course, um, who love to blame women for their whoever they're in relationship with for their sex life. Of course, it's usually the partnership is always 50-50 either way. Men have a harder time understanding that. Of course, I'm sure you've realized that by now, Kim. With most things, but I just feel like there's so much to that. So much trauma, and I talk about it probably too much on my show, if that's possible. But it's amazing to hear you tell that story, and I'm a big fan of Bruce's. He's such an inspiration, and so cool to hear how you have taken that truth and understood it for your line of work. And I God, there's really something to that. So I hope everyone who's listening is like becoming very curious about their own relationships and sex life and where it's at and where it could be with a little bit of the right pursuit and healing. I'm just putting that out there for people. um, yeah. And so I want to take you a little far out with me, Kim. I know that you're amazing and you're wonderfully grounded, but the name of my show is Far Out with Faust, so I want to see how far out into the stars I can bring you before we come back. And I know you've traveled a lot, and you've seen a lot, you've done a lot of incredible things, but I'm wondering, and I'm sure that this is, energetically, I don't, you are very, very evolved, and you understand. Um, I'm sure more than most about how much we are spiritual beings having a human experience, and everything is truly energy. And I'm wondering if besides sex, which is, I think, an incredible doorway to these energies and to mystical experiences, and I'm aware of that. I'm wondering if you've had any experiences with the supernatural, or with I mean, there's a lot of people who see things in the sky, on in their rooms, or in dreams, in ceremonies. I'm wondering what's your craziest interaction, if you'd be willing to share a little bit about some of the most inexplicable, maybe wonderful or crazy things that have happened to you that are far out.
Hmm. Well, look, I do believe that we live in a magical world, and I would describe it as you do, that we are spiritual beings inhabiting a human body to have all breadth and depth of experiences. And I think that the magic happens most when, well, like, I think that's part of what created my whole drive for what I do, is finding the things that would bring me into states of awareness that opened me up more to the magic of life. Like, I use that word, I love the word portals. And like, sexuality was always a huge portal for me. Intimacy is a huge portal. Being in nature is a huge portal, where we get more and more grounded into the moment and aware of the magic that's happening around us all the time. And when I say magic, I guess I just mean the sense of communicating with the spirit world, or being aware of the the depth of life, the synchronicities in life. And so I how would I say this? I believe that we're able to, all of us, you know, venture into altered states of consciousness. And even if that's in other dimensions of consciousness, and do that consciously in a lucid
Mm-hmm.
way. And I think that's one of the most liberating things that we can do. Having a soul, spirit, consciousness in this body is realizing that we can actually leave it at any time. And I think that's what people are mainly trying to do when they're taking psychedelic substances to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm asserting that you don't have to do that, and you can actually get there on your own. And like, sex is a huge way to get there. Think about that.
Mm-hmm.
You're literally opening up that doorway between the other worlds, right? The energy that creates life and death, that door
That's right.
you are opening during sex. So I think I have an episode called The Psychedelics of Sex, because I don't think there's any greater way to access that energy. Well, conscious cultivation. So
Mm-hmm.
I guess I'll just be a bit vague and say the idea of being able to consciously visit other worlds.
I like that. The word kundalini comes up a lot these days, with it being its entire own, one of the many yoga practices. But I mean, if for my listeners, if you've ever, some of you, I'm sure, have had a kundalini experience, but it's a very sexual, sensual, sexual experience. I don't know how else to put it. I mean, I had, I mean, on more than one occasion, in a plant ceremony, and it's amazing how we seek out, ways to open those portals in ourselves, and then, ideally, once they're open and we've laid the neurological circuitry for them, then you cultivate those neural pathways, and you keep them open, so that you don't have to go and I mean, unless you want to. There are people who make pilgrimage and do it kind of annually, and there's nothing wrong with that. I'm similar in that fashion, but it's just amazing to me, Kim, that we do that. We seek out different ways to open ourselves up, And I had that. I had an incredible experience, more than one, in implant ceremony. But again, all roads lead back to Rome. It's all the same energy. It was always coming back to the same life force, that same Kundalini kind of energy that is just like a coiled godlike spring serpent. So anyway, I just figured I would comment back, piggyback your statement. So finally, before we go, what advice would you give to people who are listening, who have a happy relationship for the most part, don't have the best sex, have accepted that as part of their, and I know we've been talking about this. I guess what I'm looking for is maybe a shorter bit of advice. If they are interested in improving, where would you where would you tell them to begin to look? And I know this is different for everyone, but is there some place you can kind of point them to that maybe they can begin their journey to this kind of wonderful awakening and practice?
Right. And I guess I would start with saying that it's possible for everyone, right? Life changing, wild, passionate, transformational, just saw God sex is possible for everyone. So I want to lay that as the foundation, right? So people are rationalizing, well, we make really good partners, we're good buddies, we're good parents together, we just don't really have that much. No, the whole point of your relationship and what you're massively missing out on is the power of that sexual connection. So I have 5 seasons worth of my Orgasmic Enlightenment podcast out
Tell
there.
everybody where to find them.
Well, anywhere good podcasts are found, I
Right.
guess. And I have a YouTube channel that I'm less active on, but there's still a wonderful library of resources on there as well. And just start listening and talking. Like ideally, like if your partner is at least intrigued, you can listen to, say, an episode together and then talk about it afterward. If they're not yet, listen to a bunch yourself, and then you might start broaching some of these topics with them. But that's just helping you to see what's possible, right? I said that earlier, is that most
Mhm.
people don't know what they don't know. And there's so much effort to detour people away from this truth. And so if you start listening to these episodes, listen to some of these well fucked all stars, hear them say they were in these places where they couldn't have an orgasm, they were on the
Mhm.
verge of divorce, on and on and on, right? Premature ejaculator, two pump chump, and then suddenly they can have sex for 3 hours. They revitalize their marriage. It's the best it's ever been. This woman has 30 orgasms in a row. It's one thing for me to say, hey, y'all, you can do it. Go
Right.
listen to them, right? Where they went from being in real challenge,
Yeah.
trouble, to having this incredible change. So that would be a great place to start, is listening to episodes, watching some videos, and then talking about it, right? Trying to be and commit to really open, honest conversation, because maybe what you need to say is, I'm not happy with the way things are. Like, is there another layer that we could get to? And being honest about where you are right now will liberate you to be able to move into a higher level and a more authentic level of being. But we've also been programmed into white lies aren't actual lies, right? Like
Yeah.
that, like holding things back is somehow beneficial for your relationship, where I'm more of a proponent of radical honesty and open communication as the greatest lubricating agent and aphrodisiac there is.
Again, I'm left almost speechless because I know what you're saying to be true. I've experienced it, and speaking your truth in these situations, regardless of how comfortable it may be, and regardless of how conditioned you are into thinking that that's not important compared to everything else, kids, family, whatever it is, you're putting the cart, right, the horse, no, the cart before the horse. You're tying your shoes together before the race. There's great power in speaking your truth, even at someone else's, at the expense of their comfort, right? Even if it's the person you love, it's worth being honest about what's going on, especially if there is an earnest desire with the couple to be in a happy relationship. If you lead from the heart and that's where you go, and you can't go wrong. Maybe there's a little bit of uncomfortability while these things are aired, but it's worth it because there's always a resolution and there's always liberated energy that comes with speaking your truth. So I agree, Kim. I think the work you're doing is profound and important, and I'm so glad that we finally got a chance to talk and to introduce you to my audience. It's an honor. I appreciate you.
Likewise, thank you so much for having me on. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you so much, Kim. And you have a great day where you are. I know you're just getting started, and I'll have a great night. And I'll let you know when this is going to come out. We'll be in touch with everything.
Okay, great. And you were a great interviewer. It's like a lovely conversational, but covering deep questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Kim. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
You take care, and maybe we'll talk again one day.
Sure.
Thank you
Sounds
so
good.
much.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.